Hey everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ for a 5-minute study through Matthew chapter 8. And as always, if you would like the free handout that you're about to see in a second, there's a link down in the description below. You can get it on our website. When did the events of this chapter take place? So this is during Jesus' earthly ministry, which is pretty much all of the book of Matthew. That took place somewhere between 26 and 31 AD. There's several important characters in this chapter. There's, of course, Jesus. He's the Messiah. He's just been preaching. He just gave the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. There's a man with leprosy who Jesus is going to meet right when he comes down from the mountain. There's a centurion. This is a Roman military officer, and he had a paralyzed servant that he wanted Jesus to heal. This chapter also mentions the Apostle Peter's mother-in-law. She was sick, and 2 demon-possessed men who lived in the tombs around the area of the Gadarenes. Where did the events of this chapter take place? Well, as we mentioned in chapter 5 through chapter 7, we don't know where the Sermon on the Mount was preached. There's a tradition that it was preached on what has come to be known as the Mount of the Beatitudes near Capernaum. We know that both the centurion's servant and Peter's mother-in-law were healed at Capernaum, and we'll talk about that in a second. The end of the chapter tells us that Jesus went to the Gadarenes to meet those 2 demon-possessed men. The Gadarenes is also known as the region of the Gerasenes, and the exact location isn't known, but most people think it's on the east to southeast side of the Sea of Galilee. So now for our outline of the chapter. The very first section, Jesus is coming down from the mountain where he's been preaching in verses 1 through 4, and a man with leprosy, this disease, comes up to him, and he asks Jesus to heal him, and Jesus grants his request. But interestingly, he tells the man to keep quiet about the miracle and not to say anything to anyone. The next section, verses 5 through 13, there's a centurion who comes to Jesus. This centurion has a paralyzed servant that he wants Jesus to heal. And Jesus was willing to go to his house and to heal the man, but the centurion said, no, I'm not worthy for you to come into my house. Just say the word and it'll be done. The text says that Jesus marveled and he commended the centurion's faith. And then Jesus, speaking about the future of his church and those who would be his disciples, he foretold how the Gentiles, like the centurion, non-Jewish people, they would enter into the kingdom of heaven, but many of the Jews would refuse. The next section is pretty short, so I just have a heading for this section, verses 14 through 17. Peter, he was married, and his mother-in-law was sick with a fever. So Jesus went to her house and healed her. And there were a lot of other people who then came to Jesus for healing. In the next section, verses 18 through 22, Jesus begins talking about what it was going to take in order to be one of his disciples. There was this scribe who came up to Jesus, and he told Jesus that he wanted to be one of his followers. Jesus told him that he needed to be ready to give up his earthly comforts in order to do that because, as he said, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. He didn't have a house with a lot of the comforts that other people had. Another man then approached Jesus, and he wanted to follow him, but he said that he wanted to go bury his father before he did that. And Jesus told him, let the dead bury their own dead. Now, verses 23 through 27 are a very popular story. Jesus calms the storm on Galilee. So Jesus and his 12 apostles, they get into a boat, and they're determined to cross the sea. On their journey, the storm kicked up, and it threatened to drown them in their little boat. But Jesus stood up and he rebuked the winds and the sea, and everything went calm. And the apostles were just stunned. They said, what kind of man is this that even the water and the wind obey him? And then finally, verses 28 through 34, Jesus meets 2 demon-possessed men in the region of the Gadarenes. So they make it across the sea. They meet these 2 men who live in the tombs. And the demons that were possessing these men, they recognized Jesus as the Son of God, and they asked Jesus not to punish them, but to allow them to go and to possess a herd of pigs, since they knew they were going to be cast out of these 2 men. It's kind of a strange request, but Jesus actually granted their request. He sent them into the pigs, and the pigs proceeded to run down a steep cliff and drown in the Sea of Galilee. The people of the region then came out and asked Jesus if he would leave. So there's a lot going on in this chapter, but when we look at it in the big picture of the Bible story, one thing that's really interesting here is that Jesus foretells the demographics of his future church. Although Jesus was going to preach his message almost exclusively to Jews, and the early church was going to be preaching almost exclusively to Jews, most of the Jews were going to reject the message and the Messiah. God always planned that eventually the Gentiles would be invited to be a part of the kingdom of God. And when they were given that opportunity, they proved to be much more receptive than their Jewish companions. And an application here, that is that faith isn't always found where you might expect to find it. In the first century, the Jews didn't think that the Gentiles had a whole lot to teach them about faith. But Jesus really commended this Roman centurion and held him up as an example of faith because of his belief that Jesus could heal his servant. We should always keep our eyes open for examples of admirable faith. It's not always found in pulpits or in church leadership. Sometimes it's found in the places you least expect it.